the entire town gathered to watch two legends kill each other. But when the smoke cleared, the man still standing did something no one in the West could ever explain. In the dying years of the frontier, when railroads were beginning to tame the wilderness and law slowly replaced chaos, one town still lived in the shadow of old legends. The town was called Red Mesa. Dust ruled its streets. Wind scraped across crooked wooden buildings. The saloon doors never stopped swinging, and the cemetery on the hill grew faster than the town itself. But Red Mesa was not famous for its mines or cattle. It was famous for a duel that had not yet happened. For weeks, rumors moved through the town like wildfire through dry grass. Cowboys whispered about it in the saloon. Store owners leaned across counters, repeating the same question. Was it really going to happen? Two names kept surfacing in every conversation: Silas Creed and Jonah Vale. Both men were ghosts from the violent years of the frontier. Men whose reputations had spread across deserts, rail towns, and outlaw camps alike. Silas Creed was known as the fastest draw anyone had ever seen. Tall, quiet, and cold-eyed. He had survived more gunfights than anyone could count. Some said he never missed. Others said he didn't even blink before pulling the trigger. Jonah Vale was different. Older, slower, perhaps, but far more dangerous. He wasn't known for speed. He was known for patience. Vale had a reputation for walking into impossible situations and walking out alive. Towns remembered him the way soldiers remember a battlefield, quietly and with unease. For nearly 15 years, the two men had avoided each other. Asterisk, not because they feared one another, because everyone believed that if they ever met, only one would walk away. Now, fate had finally brought them to the same dusty street. No one knew who had sent the message. No one knew who had challenged whom. But the result was certain. At high noon, in the center of Red Mesa, the two greatest gunslingers the frontier had ever known would face each other. Asterisk, long before Red Mesa became the stage for their final meeting. The names Silas Creed and Jonah Vale had already carved their way into frontier legend. But the truth was, their stories had begun in the same place. Years earlier, when the frontier was still wild and law was little more than a suggestion, both men rode under the same banner. They were young, then dangerous, fearless, and hungry for reputation. They worked as hired guns for rail companies, ranch owners, and sometimes even the law. When the law needed men willing to do what badges alone could not, Silas Creed had been the rising star. He was barely 20 when people first started talking about him. Lean silent, with eyes that studied everything. His speed with a revolver was something people struggled to explain. By the time most men realized a fight had started, Creed had already finished it. Gunfighters feared him. Outlaws avoided towns when they heard he was nearby. But Jonah Vale was different. Where Creed was quick, Vale was careful. Where Creed relied on speed, Vale relied on reading people. He watched hands. He watched breathing. He watched the quiet movements that came before violence. Older by nearly 15 years, Vale had already lived through more gunfights than most men survived in a lifetime. Some said he had once been a lawman. Others said he had once been an outlaw. The truth about Jonah Vale was something no one ever seemed able to confirm. For several years, the two men rode together. They were hired to track cattle rustlers across the desert. They escorted gold shipments through bandit country. They hunted men who had made powerful enemies. Together, they were nearly unstoppable. Creed brought speed, Vale brought judgment. And in the brutal mathematics of the frontier, that combination was deadly. But every partnership in the West eventually comes to an end. The moment that broke them happened outside a small mining settlement called Arroyo Crossing. A gang of outlaws had robbed a payroll shipment and taken refuge in the hills. Creed and Vale were hired to bring them back, or bury them. What followed became one of the bloodiest gunfights the territory had ever seen. When the shooting stopped, 6 outlaws were dead. 2 miners had been caught in the crossfire, and something between Creed and Vale had changed forever. Witnesses later said the argument between the 2 men lasted nearly an hour. Creed believed the job had been simple: eliminate the threat. Vale believed Creed had pulled the trigger too quickly, too recklessly. The miners' deaths hung in the air like smoke that refused to clear. By nightfall, the partnership was finished. Creed rode south, Vale rode north. For the next 15 years, they built separate legends across the frontier. They never crossed paths again until the message arrived in Red Mesa, a single line written on worn paper. High noon. One last draw. Asterisk, by the time the sun rose over Red Mesa on the morning of the duel, the entire town already knew what day it was. People moved through the streets with a quiet tension that felt heavier than the desert heat. Shop owners opened their doors early but did little business. Cowboys sat outside the saloon with cups of bitter coffee, watching the empty street as if the duel might begin at any moment. No one laughed that morning. By 10 o'clock, strangers had started arriving from nearby ranches and settlements. Riders tied their horses along the hitching rails and joined the growing crowd. Everyone wanted to witness the same thing: the end of a legend in the center of town. The street had already begun to clear. Wagons were moved aside. Windows were filled with silent faces. Even the saloon piano had gone quiet. Red Mesa had seen gunfights before, but never anything like this. Silas Creed arrived first. He rode into town just after 11. Alone, his horse moving slowly through the dust. The moment people recognized him, conversations died instantly. Creed dismounted in front of the saloon. He looked exactly like the stories described him: tall, lean, calm. A dark coat hung from his shoulders, and a single revolver rested low on his hip. His face carried no expression, but his eyes moved across the town with quiet awareness. He saw the crowd, he saw the rooftops, he saw the windows. Every possible threat was measured without a word. Then he stepped into the street and waited for nearly 20 minutes. Nothing happened. The sun climbed higher, the air grew hotter, and the silence became unbearable. Then, finally, another rider appeared at the far end of town. Jonah Vale and the entire town would be there to watch history end. The crowd held its breath. Every person in Red Mesa understood the same truth. This was not just a gunfight. This was the final chapter of 15 years of unfinished history. Creed's hand rested near his revolver. Vale's arms hung loosely at his sides. Neither man blinked. Neither man spoke, but everyone watching could feel it. The past had finally caught up with them, and within seconds, only one legend would remain. The church bell in Red Mesa struck noon. The single metallic sound echoed across the town like a signal. No one could ignore. Dust rolled across the street as the wind picked up, pushing small spirals of sand between. The 2 men standing 30 feet apart. Every eye in the town was fixed on them. Silas Creed didn't move. Jonah Vale didn't move either. But something had shifted. For the first time since Vale arrived, the 2 men looked directly into each other's eyes, not as enemies, as men who already understood. How this would end, Creed's fingers hovered just inches from his revolver. Fast, precise, everyone watching knew what would happen next. They had heard the stories. Most believed Vale didn't stand a chance against Creed's speed. The entire street felt frozen. Then it happened. Creed moved first. His hand dropped toward the revolver with lightning speed. The motion so fast, most people barely saw it begin. But Vale had already seen it. In the same instant, Creed's gun cleared the holster. Vale fired. One single shot cracked through the silence. The sound echoed against the wooden buildings and rolled. Out across the desert, Silas Creed staggered. His revolver slipped from his hand and struck the dirt with a dull thud. For a brief moment, he remained standing, as if his body had not yet understood what had happened. Then his knees buckled. Creed collapsed into the dust. The greatest gunslinger the frontier had ever known had been shot before he could fire. Gasps spread through the crowd. People looked at one another in disbelief. They had expected a lightning duel, 2 shots, maybe more, but it had ended with only one. Jonah Vale slowly lowered his revolver. The town watched in stunned silence as the older gunslinger walked forward toward the fallen legend. No cheers, no celebration, only the sound of Vale's boots against the dirt as he approached the man everyone thought could never lose. For several seconds after the gunshot, Red Mesa stood completely still. No one spoke. No one moved. The dust slowly settled around the body lying in the center of the street. Silas Creed, the fastest gun the frontier had ever known, was face down in the dirt. Men who had traveled days just to witness the duel stared in disbelief. Some had bet money on Creed. Others had come simply to see if the stories were true. Now, the answer lay motionless in the road. Jonah Vale stood over him quietly. His revolver hung loosely in his hand, smoke still drifting from the barrel. But Vale showed no sign of victory. No pride, no relief, only silence. The crowd began whispering. Some said Vale had cheated. Others argued that Creed had simply underestimated the older man. But no one dared step forward. After a moment, Vale slowly knelt beside the fallen gunslinger. The town leaned forward, trying to see what he was doing. Creed was still alive. Barely. The bullet had struck high in the chest. Blood darkened his coat as his breathing struggled against the growing weight in his lungs. Vale removed his hat and placed it on the ground beside him. For a long moment, he simply looked at Creed. 2 men who had once ridden side by side across the frontier. 2 men whose lives had split apart because of one moment years ago. Creed coughed, struggling for air. Then, with visible effort, he lifted his eyes toward Vale. No anger. No fear. Only a tired understanding. Some in the crowd expected Vale to finish the job. Many gunfighters believed a wounded enemy should never be left alive. But Vale did not reach for his gun. Instead, he did something no one expected. He leaned closer to Creed and said something so quiet that the crowd could not hear it. Creed listened. For a moment, the dying gunslinger's face softened. Then, slowly, he nodded. Vale stood up again. He stepped back from the body and looked across the silent crowd of Red Mesa. And that was when the town realized something strange. Jonah Vale had not come to Red Mesa to prove he was the better gun. He had come for something else entirely. The silence in Red Mesa grew heavier with every passing second. Jonah Vale stood in the middle of the street while the entire town waited to see what he would do next. Silas Creed lay in the dust behind him, barely breathing. Most men in the crowd believed they already knew how the story would end. They had seen gunfighters before. The rule of the frontier was simple. When one man fell, the other walked away. But Vale didn't leave. Instead, he slowly turned back toward Creed. The wounded gunslinger was still conscious, though only just. Each breath looked painful now, shallow and slow. Blood had begun soaking deeper into the dirt beneath him. Vale crouched beside him once more. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Creve finally whispered something. Only a few people in the front of the crowd heard it. Why? The question barely left his lips. But Vale heard it clearly. The older gunslinger looked down at the man he had once ridden beside through deserts, gunfights, and lawless towns. 15 years of distance suddenly felt smaller than the dusty street. Around them, Vale answered quietly. You asked for this? Some in the crowd exchanged confused looks. Creed had asked for it. That made no sense. The stories spreading through Red Mesa claimed the duel had been inevitable, something written by fate long ago. But Vale continued speaking. His voice was calm, familiar, almost tired. You sent the message, Vale said. Creed's breathing faltered slightly. Yes. A ripple of confusion moved through the watching crowd. Creed had challenged Vale. Then why did the dying man look almost relieved? Vale lowered his voice even further. Arroyo Crossing, he said. For a moment, Creed closed his eyes. The name alone carried 15 years of silence between them. The miners, the gunfight, the argument that had ended everything. When Creed opened his eyes again, there was no denial left in them. I never stopped seeing their faces, he whispered. The crowd could no longer hear the conversation, but the tension in the street deepened. Creed struggled for another breath. I was too fast, he continued weakly. Too eager. The words sounded like a confession spoken long after the crime. Vale remained still beside him. Creed's eyes drifted toward the sky for a moment before returning to Vale. I couldn't live with it anymore. The truth finally settled into place. The duel had never been about proving who was faster. It had been about judgment. Creed had summoned the one man whose opinion still mattered. Jonah Vale, the man who had once called him reckless, the man who had walked away from him 15 years earlier. Creed's voice was barely audible now. Now I know, he whispered. Vale watched him carefully. Know what? He asked. Creed exhaled slowly. That you were right. The words lingered in the air for only a moment. Then Silas Creed's chest rose one final time and fell. The greatest gunslinger the frontier had ever feared died quietly in the dust of Red Mesa. No dramatic last stand, no second shot, just silence. For a long moment, Jonah Vale remained, kneeling beside him. The town watched without speaking, unsure whether they had just witnessed justice, or something much stranger. Vale slowly closed Kriya's eyes. 15 years earlier, they had ridden together across a violent land, where survival often meant pulling the trigger first. Creed had become the fastest, gun alive. But speed had never been the thing that haunted him. It was the moment at Arroyo Crossing. 2. Innocent men caught between bullets that were never meant for them. For years, the frontier had praised Creed as a legend. But legends rarely carried the weight of their own mistakes. Creed had died, and in the end, he had chosen the only judge whose verdict he trusted. Jonah Vale stood up slowly. The watching crowd instinctively stepped back as he walked away from the body in the street. No one tried to stop him. No one spoke. His name, the duel that everyone expected to prove who ruled the frontier, had revealed something very different. Sometimes the fastest gun in the West was not the one who pulled the trigger first. Sometimes it was the man strong enough to face the truth. He had been running from Vale, mounted his horse at the edge of town. Without looking back, he rode out into the desert, and the legend of the duel in Red Mesa spread across the frontier not as the story of a victory, but as the story of A judgment. 15 years in the making. Legends are often built on speed, reputation, and fear. But the stories that last the longest are the ones about choices and the weight they carry. If you enjoy dark, cinematic, frontier stories, where every decision has a cost, subscribe to Whispers of the West and step deeper into the forgotten legends of the frontier. The West was never as simple as the stories make it seem.